So the internet is very divided, but there's one thing the internet seems to agree on, and that is that education is broken.
Pretty much every player in the system is ridden by fear, is my observation. It's the political level fearing their electorate. It is the level of the school or even the concrete teacher fearing to get stressed out by parents who always think, school is failing their kids maybe. But it's also parents, conversely, who are saying, we just want the standard thing of our kid, don't experiment. Don't start with our grade, our kids. You can experiment next year.
The parents don't want to take that risk because when it comes to their kids, they're just extremely risk averse. They want to complain, but they don't want to live it. And the students, I think, are the ones really getting screwed in this whole setup, right? Because they're almost like a piece on a chessboard with not as much agency structurally as they should have. And I think in some ways, the way to sort of try to solve for this is to empower the students and to sort of, let them get more agency back.
The motto of the school is an education towards freedom. You lead people towards freedom. For me, quite honestly, that was the best that could have happened to me because I truly had that freedom, and school was mandatory, but I skipped it all the time, and I was very good at school, so I could afford it, and my life was happening somewhere else. Had I not had this freedom, I think it would have been really, really difficult for me. Only free people can take responsibility. And if you take responsibility, this is a true act of freedom because you decide, nobody else decides on your behalf. And you deal with the consequences of your decisions. I studied history in Munich and Paris. I studied economics at London School of Economics. My first job, I worked for 7 years at the OECD.
You were a guest at Munich University of Digital Technologies, which I've been associated with since last year now.
I think MUT is the university is unique in two ways. On the one hand, there is just a very strong focus on teaching. That is unique enough in a university environment. And the other thing, it's really also the attempt not only to teach a subject matter, which of course, you study a subject, you want to learn about it and you want to learn all the tools, all the methods surrounding it. But even more fundamentally, this institution teaches students to understand how learning in its fullest sense actually functions, which is, that's what always employers are asking for. They want employees who are able to adapt, to learn new things, to continuously evolve, but nobody actually teaches that. They come out of school, they don't know how to learn. And there is this quote that I really like from one of the extreme sports buddies that I was training with at some point. And he was saying, in the Arctic, nobody can hide his character. And that's quite true because there's no facade. There's no society. There's no nothing to hide behind. And you will know this fine line. If you're on the good side of the line, you stretch yourself, you confront yourself, and you will learn something new. Because if you don't go out, you don't learn something new. That is clear. But if you go beyond that, you just risk to destabilize yourself.
So you have these, and you go in there with that blank piece of paper. You are taking ownership for your entire academic year. And of course, you have a guide. It's about empathy. It's, again, not about you. It's about the people around you. And, anti-woke movement does not understand is they just destroy empathy. They don't realize that empathy is such a big foundation of our humanity, of us as a species. And I think what the woke bunch don't understand is that it's essentially narcissism at its worst, because all you're doing is just obsessing and playing the victim and being the victim and whatnot, right? It's not about you. Look out of your shell and see the world for what it is and acknowledge it for what it is and do something about it. I think the danger is to polarize on one of these two extremes. But these two extremes these are mirages, these are fake things that have emerged because this very central reality has not been articulated clearly, right? Because once you articulate it like that, it's about curiosity, it's about the world, it's about a sense of agency and responsibility in that world. And it's not a responsibility just for yourself. It's not about stuffing your pockets. It's also about others. You bring these two things together and both the woke and the anti-woke essentially, disappear, right?
You don't make with this, what you describe as the dog pedagogy, you don't make people stronger. You don't make people stronger when you define everything and you pretend that's how the world is working. And that leads back to something we also touched on, which is, if you are in the pseudo comfort all the time, not least because you put your head in the sand, you don't look about into everything that's uncomfortable. Yeah, it looks pretty. It feels and looks pretty comfortable. And then you can stay on your leash. It is an incredible motivation to be the best version of yourself. I mean, as I said, you want to show yourself worthy to be admitted, which means that you always have to be the best version of yourself.
Do you have that sense of surrender, of taking responsibility, of betterment, of passing on, that sense of gratitude? Are those emotions associated with what you do, or is it much more, is it more about, again, narcissism, about looking in the mirror and do I have the biggest bicep and where can I flex it?
You have to let them off the leash. If you keep them on the leash, or you put them, in some box, they will just die. That's not the environment they can function in. So if you want not only these performers to survive and flourish, but you want to get the most out of them, you have to let them run and put them with all their energy onto a useful path.
That is fear driven again, right? Let it be curiosity driven and not fear driven.
Yeah.
Let it be about taking ownership and responsibility, and let it not be narcissistic, and let it be about empathy and empowering others. Somewhere above the Arctic Circle, in a summer hut in Svalbard, my guest once opened a book and found a black and white photograph of a man in a snowstorm, his collar up against the wind. She could not say why, but it hit her, and she decided she would not rest until she had experienced the Arctic like that. She worked for nearly 2 years to make it happen. The same woman spent 7 years as a policy analyst at the OECD in Paris, drafting education policy recommendations for governments. Kathrin Höckel's life runs on one idea, that real learning happens when you leave the familiar and step into something you cannot fully control. It started at a Steiner school in Mainz, where she skipped class to train horses in classical dressage. It carried on through history and politics at LMU Munich, a master's at the London School of Economics, a fellowship at Harvard, and one at MIT. During those Harvard and MIT years, she bought a touring bike and rode it across the United States from the East Coast to the West Coast, then later across Russia, from Murmansk in the north to Sochi in the south. And then she even ran trails in Kenya with the best distance runners in the world. The Arctic came later. A line she loves from one of the extreme sport companions she trained with is that in the Arctic, nobody can hide their character. Lately, she has been working with Tom, who spent his career in the special forces of the police, on what people who handle life or death situations can teach the rest of us. At -40, one mistake with your gloves and the dominoes start to fall. What stands out to her about people like Tom is the level of responsibility they carry and the freedom that comes with it. And she thinks that is exactly what schools have stopped teaching. This one is personal for me. I grew up in an alternative school too. At 15, they handed me a blank timetable and a pen and told me to go and decide what I wanted to learn and from whom. It is about freedom and the responsibility that comes with it. My school was built on integral education, the physical, the emotional, the mental, and the spiritual, all at once. And years later, I wondered whether I could discreetly ignore the spiritual part and keep the rest. Earlier this year, Kathrin visited my school and she answered a question I had carried in me for a long time. So this is a conversation between two people who both started in free schools, then successfully adapted into traditional structures and systems, and then eventually chose to run free again like Mustangs on the other side. We get into why education is fundamentally broken, how much of it runs on fear, why a special forces mindset might be the right teacher, and what it actually means to treat learning as an adventure. Stay to the end. You may want to set off on your own. Hi, Kathrin. Welcome to the System Gambit.
Hi, Ritavan. Thank you very much for having me.
So the internet is very divided, but there's one thing the internet seems to agree on, and that is that education is broken. And let's take this theme and sort of slowly unpack it and understand what is going on. So one of the sources of anger is that people who treated a degree as an investment feel that that money is lost and they're not getting the ROI they want. And so you have a lot of anger around college or whatever is a scam. So, what do you think is going on and what are all the dimensions according to you?
It is fair to say that education or the education system, especially nowadays, is an inherently conservative system. And increasingly, there is a disconnect between what education represents and does in reality and what is required and what's going on at the societal level. So that might explain this very fundamental disagreement, or even, as you say, anger that is projected into education. And you could say at the individual level, because, if you ask, so what's education for in the 21st century? I believe at the individual level, it should be showing young people a pathway into these very fundamental questions, which is, who am I? What is my pathway? What am I here to do? And what are the tools to actually get there? So, these are very big questions, but these are questions where the education system doesn't seem to have a good answer for. And at the societal level, it's very much about what can I contribute? How can we lead young people into a position of taking responsibility? And there again, I think there's big gaps.
And why do you think that is the case? Like, what's at the root of this? What are the constituent parts, and how are they linked?
Yeah, my observation is that at all levels, there is a lot of fear and a lot of things happening in reality in the education system. And that, if education system is such a broad term, I guess what you also mean is essentially the official school system, the official, what the role of the state putting young people through some sort of mandatory education. And pretty much every player in the system is ridden by fear, is my observation. It's the political level fearing their electorate. It is the level of the school or even the concrete teacher fearing to get stressed out by parents who always think, school is failing their kids, maybe. But it's also parents, conversely, who are saying, we just want the standard thing of our kid, don't experiment. Don't start with our grade, our kids. You can experiment next year. That's fantastic. But just, don't experiment. So there's a lot of this thing about, it seems like it's almost better not to do anything different just because it could go wrong. So rather than trying something out, which you could say, it could become something fantastic or at least a little bit better. It's inherently conservative, and there's an inertia ridden by fear to make a mistake.
And I think that's why I thought it'd be really great to have you on. This podcast is called The System Gambit, and it's based around the idea of the system gambit from my upcoming book. And what you're describing as the situation of the education system is very much sort of the opposite of the system gambit, which I call the system anti-gambit. And the idea is the following: is optimize the metrics, the goals, etc. of that system, because that's all you know, and that's what everyone feels comfortable doing, despite knowing that system cannot grow and compound the way you want. That system does not have the structural feedback loop that would allow you to keep compounding and growing. And so a big necessity at that point is to sacrifice the metrics in the current system, meaning in this case, for example, it would be trying out something new, experimenting and trying to build that feedback loop. But that means short term, there might be a drop in performance in the existing system. And from what you described, no one wants that. The teachers don't want to take that risk because, why would they? Their job's on the line. The parents don't want to take that risk because when it comes to their kids, they're just extremely risk averse. They want to complain, but they don't want to live it. And the students, I think, are the ones really getting screwed in this whole setup, right? Because they're almost like a piece on a chessboard with not as much agency structurally as they should have. And I think in some ways, the way to sort of try to solve for this is to empower the students and to sort of, let them get more agency back. What are your thoughts on that? And have I sort of framed it correctly?
Absolutely. It's remarkable at what level the education system is a structure where there's so much reform going on constantly. There's this reform and that reform. It's all fiddling at the margin. It doesn't ever fundamentally change for exactly the reason that we've already mentioned now. And then also there's another element that you can add to consider, which is if you think of the career of a teacher, it's a person who's gone through the system. So it's their own experience. Then they go to study at the university, which is sort of to an extent part of this whole education system. And then they go back. So they're never confronted with the real world be it by running a business, being by just working in a completely different structure. So this is another element that seems to me crucial in this self-referential structure that keeps reproducing itself. And surely the students are the ones who don't get what I mentioned at the outset, which is, these tools to essentially run your life. These very fundamental questions around, what are my needs? What are my wishes? How do I break them down into something that is actually a concrete life path? And then what are the tools to go along successfully? And this is essentially what learning is all about. But strangely enough, that form of learning doesn't really happen in a school setting. So everything around it, but it seems like almost this core part is left out.
Yeah, and I think what you describe has so many parallels also in industry and business, because I usually have entrepreneurs and investors on this podcast, but I just want to highlight the parallels. So you describe a system where people from within the system stay in the system. They seem to tweak and do stuff. So there's a lot of noise and activity, but very little change. And this is exactly, and you might have heard and seen this, especially in Germany where we're from. But I mean, this is happening around the world. There was this whole excitement around digital transformation where all one did was just tweak here and there, change a system, upgrade some software, etc. It brought no value because the core goal and the core value creating mechanism behind digital technologies wasn't really thought through and understood, and that structural position that allows for compounding value wasn't built. And now is a similar thing happening with AI too. It's just, let's just buy it, let's use it. It's all adoption driven or simple automation driven, and that's not where the value is. And so there's so many parallels, and I think that's why it's really great to have you here, because one sees, and it affects everyone, right? So all these business people, entrepreneurs, investors, everyone who's been on the pod, they all have children and they all care about education. And so I think this is a very universal problem, and we see the same pattern appear there. You also speak about the PISA study, and there's a bunch of sort of quantitative stuff out there that puts numbers to this problem. And of course, what we don't want to do is go down a rabbit hole where we're sort of picking 2 or 3 studies and then someone else picks something else, right? That's not the point here. I think the point is just broadly to show the trend and to show why the trend is worrying. So given your experience in education policy internationally, do you want to sort of shed some light there, give some context and also some historical context of how things were, how they've been evolving and where it's trending?
I mean, if you touch on PISA data, which, as we know, is one way of depicting the quality of an education system, because it shows the level of mastery of fundamental skills, reading, writing, math, science, which is universally used at the moment to compare and contrast and to see what's working well, what's not working well. This is, of course, a partial view on what education is about, but it's still quite a relevant one. And the interesting part about the PISA data is not only that it's not universal, it's sort of international. There are lots of countries taking part in the study, but it's also been going on for quite a while. And what you see in the PISA data most recently is a general drop in cognitive skills around the world, in some countries more than others. And that's quite worrying because, I mean, in the beginning, everyone was trying to say this is linked to COVID and this disruptive times.
The lockdowns, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So all the disruption happening around Corona time, like the COVID period. But if you look into the data, it's quite clear that this trend has started earlier on. So there might be a dip, but it's not something that you can attribute. So the question is, what else is going on? And, without sort of going into all the data and the details, but this has a lot to do with what you just mentioned about a misunderstanding of using technology, for instance. Everyone is buying hardware. That doesn't help. A lot of people use technology, young people use technology, and it's not the technology per se that's either good or bad. It's a tool, right? You have a blackboard, you have a whiteboard, you have a smartboard. It doesn't make a difference. The question is, how do you use it? And the same holds for, do you use it as an enhancing mechanism, something that gives you access, something that allows you to upgrade your search tools or knowledge tools, or is it something that you misunderstand as a helping device that replaces learning? And that's actually quite frightening. There's more and more studies coming up with respect to the relationship of AI and learning. It's the same story. Only if you are a proficient user and you know how to use these tools, they will upgrade your learning process. If you use it as a replacement instead of doing the hard work, which, learning, there's always an effort involved, otherwise it wouldn't be learning, then it's actually dumbing people down. So everything around technology and AI needs to be implemented in a smart way. It's not per se an advantage. Technology, if it's distractful and, it's more of an entertainment distraction rather than a helping device, that's part of the picture. Then there's lots of other factors that have been analyzed, such as, fewer parents supporting the education process at home, et cetera, et cetera. So, but overall, this is a bit of an alarming trend, and even more a call for reconsidering the role of school and the education system in how does this learning process actually work? What supports actual learning and not just knowledge acquisition, for instance, learning something by heart and being able to reproduce it. We all know that's less and less important. Funnily enough, that's mostly what's still taking place. So I guess that's just a bit of a warning sign, and hopefully inspiring for lots of people to think more about, if the goal of education is learning, then what promotes learning more than anything else? That should be the central question.
Yeah, let me just double click on 2 points before we continue. So one is this idea of to be able to use, and let's just replace AI with LLMs to be specific here, because that's what most people mean in this context. So to use LLMs effectively, the more and the better you know your subject, the better the answer or the more useful the LLM is to you. And this is Anthropic's own research, right? Because they just have a bunch of people using their stuff. And so they're this is proprietary data to them, and they publish it publicly. And one of the insights there was that the more knowledgeable you were about a topic, the better quality answers you could get from the LLM. And that kind of makes sense, because if you can't even formulate the context for what you want to know and understand and discuss and brainstorm or whatever with the LLM, how, if you can't provide that depth of context, how would you have a deeper conversation with the LLM? And so I think this is pretty straightforward, and I think underappreciated in this whole excitement of let's just use it, let's just let everyone use it in any way at any level. The second thing, I think, which was, you said using AI or LLMs to replace learning. I don't think, probably, just a little pushback. I don't think learning can be replaced, and I don't think that's how you meant it, but it was much more, it's just direct cheating, right? The whole point, it's just telling the LLM to do what you're supposed to do, right? I think that's what's happening. And to some extent, I think it's also because a lot of tasks that people are given during their education are just rubbish. The fact that they can cheat already means that they're not being asked the right things, right? And so this is something, when I started teaching last year in the fall to Bachelor of Engineering students, I went back and thought from first principles and said, I will only ask them for things where if they were to use an LLM, it wouldn't really bring them value, because they would have to first learn the stuff to be able to use an LLM successfully. And so in that sense, I don't care. I am like, you use whatever you want, but the thing is, if the emperor does not have clothes, everyone's going to see it, right? So can you create tasks that are such that even if they use LLMs, it's obvious not just to everyone else, but to them too, right? So like the students themselves realize, oh crap, okay, I was just cheating, and now that it is common knowledge. Everyone knows that everyone knows that everyone knows that I've been cheating. And I think that puts that question to sleep. But obviously, if you don't ask them these kind of tasks, then, they will take shortcuts and cheat.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And it has a lot to do with knowing what your questions are, right? When you don't know what your interests are, you don't have questions. And if you don't have questions, how can you possibly explore the world and learn something relevant?
This is a great transition, I think, to where we should go next, because if education is only about the acquisition of knowledge in various ways of various things, then this whole LLM thing is actually a great cheat option. But you and I both had a different kind of schooling and a different kind of education. And I think that also, it was almost a different paradigm of education and learning. And I think that shaped us. And so, it'd be great if you could sort of share that journey, start perhaps from when, where and when you're born, in what kind of context, because I think that also shapes you and its choices, because the fact that your parents allowed you to go through such a school itself, I think is important, because as we discuss, a lot of parents just are scared, don't want their child to try something new, something else, and the fact their parents did, I think, is also important. So if you can start from there, all the way to all the big name stuff you've done, I think we'll go from like birth to to postgraduate studies.
All right. That's another big question. Yeah, I mean, maybe starting with how my parents approached this. My parents are both, they're doctors and have the medical profession as their background. So they're hugely responsible people. And I think they're just taking the responsibility to say, I sent my kid or my children together with my brother to a school which is non-standard. And I take the responsibility, and that will be all right. So they're not driven by fear, and they're not looking right and left what's what everyone else is doing. They consider it and see whatever they find most appropriate. So it's a truly non-conformist approach to things. It's not conformist, it's not anti everything. It's just we decide, and that's where we're going. There is an element from my mother's side. She went through a very conservative Catholic church, education school, and suffered quite a bit from that. So all these very strict, very stupid rules, no freedom whatsoever, and sending me or sending us to this very liberal school. It was a Steiner school, Waldorf school in Germany, that's sort of the motto of the school, is an education towards freedom. You lead people towards freedom. And that was very much the opposite of what she had experienced. And that was very much motivating her to send us to the school. For me, quite honestly, that was the best that could have happened to me, because I truly had that freedom. On the one hand, I always had something more important than school in my life. It was essentially, first it was sports and competitive sports. I did the high diving, the jumps into the water. And then I started something comparable, because it is an art form and it's very disciplined, which is classical dressage. And my life was happening in the horse stables, right? And training horses. And school was mandatory, but I skipped it all the time, and I was very good at school, so I could afford it, and my life was happening somewhere else. Had I not had this freedom, I think it would have been really, really difficult for me. So that was one element.
Was this freedom intrinsic? Like, somehow I feel this personally, that it's a deep sense of freedom is something that almost my core identity. I wouldn't be able to live without it. I can look away, I can suffer through a period, but I think in a very fundamental way, I cannot live without it. Do you think it's something that's fundamental to you in that sense? Or how do you think about this idea of freedom? Because it was also the motto of your school. So I wanted to sort of dig deeper and understand where that comes from.
Absolutely. It's the most fundamental thing. And there is an interesting parallel or connection, which is only free people can take responsibility. And if you take responsibility, this is a true act of freedom, because you decide, nobody else decides on your behalf. And you deal with the consequences of your decisions. And I think that was sort of the flip side of what this school taught us. Or, I mean, you don't actually teach it to somebody, right? You support a pathway where this can quite naturally evolve. And that's this constant ask and expectation. And I think I had that both at home, at my parents, in my family environment, but also at school, which is, you have to know what you want. We are not telling you what you want. You have to know this by yourself. So figure it out. And as soon as you know what you want, we support you, right? So if there's something you really desire and you get obsessed about it, you get the freedom to go there and you get all the support, but you have to know by yourself. And that is this fundamental connection of freedom and responsibility, which I believe is just terribly lacking in society. Because if conversely you keep telling somebody what they have to learn, what they have to want, where they have to go, you just cut off any, even the slightest attempt to develop responsibility, because you also cut off freedom. So this is very, very fundamental. And that maybe just wrap up, because I mean, that's a long story, of course, you're asking me here, but that didn't prevent me from going into very standard things, if you will. I studied history in Munich and Paris. I studied economics at London School of Economics. My first job, I worked for 7 years at the OECD, PISA connection, where that's coming from. So, none of that has prevented me from doing standard career things, but I know what's underlying, which is this, you have to know what you want. And when you
And
go
you did
there,
fellowships at MIT and Harvard. So, I mean, you've ticked all the boxes when it comes to elite, sort of establishment stuff, right? So that's, it's not as if you struggle there.
no, and that's the thing, right? Freedom doesn't mean you let loose and you just run like a headless chicken. It means this constant focus, but it's not an externally imposed focus where you say, oh, you have to deliver on that one. Here's your curriculum. Here is your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you have to deliver, and you make sure you deliver. No, it's like you can essentially, you choose by yourself, but you choose. You're not just, and you learn how it works to choose and to pursue something out of your own motivation and not because somebody else imposes it on you. So,
and own the outcomes, right? I think that's the super important part, is you will own the outcomes. That is, you can't point at someone else and blame someone else, right? You cannot play the victim there because it's your choices.
Mhm.
Since we both like horses, I always sort of have this picture in mind of you're kind of born free but wild, like a Mustang, and then you get broken, right? So the let's say the various structures and setups and systems you go through is a period of being broken, like breaking a horse, not breaking a twig or something, but like breaking a horse. And then once you go through all of that, and then you choose to be free again, that's when you're truly free, because I think you've understood, firstly, you have no regret because you know what the other stuff looks like, right? So you never have that envy of, look, if I were there, I would be so much better off. And the second thing is that you've seen what it means, what consequences to your actions mean, etc. And and you've understood how constraints and discipline and a bunch of other stuff is useful as long as you are the one making the decisions. What do you think about this sort of 3-phase analogy, and how do you picture sort of the evolution of freedom for someone through their life?
Yes, I mean, I didn't feel broken going through standard institutions. For me, this was still an element of discovery, right? I mean, studying
By
it.
broken, I meant being trained, like in the sense of going through formal training, the way a horse gets trained, not broken in the sense of your
No,
spirit is
I
broken.
understand. I mean, broken in the sense, I mean, that is a term in riding, which is quite violent, actually. I mean, if you want to stay with the metaphor of horse riding, the way I practice it in classical dressage is that you, in a very soft and respectful way, start to familiarize the horse with the fact that it's now working together with a rider. And by training the horse, it becomes more and more beautiful and more strong and, showing how beautiful they are. So it's not a Mustang that gets forced at some point. It's quite brutal. So and, the formal pathway that I had was, I chose it myself still. I chose to go to these universities. I chose to start working in this organization. But I also increasingly, and you mentioned this time in Harvard, that was a gap year for me where I went out and I just realized how much more there is than just this one framework that I was used to working in. And this is what people also sometimes just forget. The longer you are in structures, and we've mentioned the school structure before, and teachers being formed there, going only to university, coming back, you just lose, the perspective of what else is going on in life. And then I just realized that I have my own ideas and I have my own compass of where I think things should be going. And if I want to pursue those ideas, it's not going to be within a formal structure because it's too constraining. And when you can go when you realize that in your the period where you're formed in school and your first job, there's so much you have to learn, so much you can explore. It's just you're a greenhorn, you know nothing. But when you start understanding something, then you can pretty much go two ways, as my observation with many other people. Either you conform and you just function in these institutions with all the limitations. It's very comfortable, but it's also very constraining. Or at some point you realize, no, I understood enough of how all this works, and I want now to have my own contribution to this world. And that's very difficult within a formal structure.
Yeah, and I think in that context, I mean, it's always easy to complain, to speak about everything that's broken. But I think part of this, of taking responsibility, is then trying to do something about it. And last week you were a guest at Munich University of Digital Technologies, which I've been associated with since last year now. And in many ways, what we're trying to do there is build an environment that sort of aligns with a lot of what we've been speaking about, that in a very unique way. And I think at a traditional, established university or University of Applied Sciences, it's much harder to do this, because you're in a legacy setup where change is not that easy to do. And in that sense, this is very much like a startup, right, where you get from the ground up the opportunity to build something. So yeah, I mean, what were your initial observations and reactions? And what was your experience like?
Yeah. I think Mute is the university is unique in two ways. On the one hand, there is just a very strong focus on teaching. That is unique enough in a university environment, because many universities are extremely research focused. Many individual professors are extremely research focused for understandable reasons, and teaching is playing a minor role, if at all. So the fact that there is so much thought going into what's good teaching and what's good student support, this is already a really unique and what the institution stands out for. And the other thing, and that's really, I mean, we've discussed this many times, it's really also the attempt not only to teach a subject matter, which of course, I mean, you study a subject, you want to learn about it and you want to learn all the tools, all the methods surrounding it. But even more fundamentally, this institution teaches students to understand how learning in its fullest sense actually functions, which is, that's what always employers are asking for. They want employees who are able to adapt, to learn new things, to continuously evolve. But nobody actually teaches that. They come out of school, they don't know how to learn. They know how to acquire some knowledge and write a test, but this much more fundamental gesture of what learning really means, nobody teaches that. And at the university, you might have, by coincidence, a professor who teaches you something beyond the subject matter, but it's also really rare. So handing over something in a structured way, not just in passive, in a structured way to students where they can essentially put on their CV, learning and adaptability as a true skill, this is so precious, and it's really not something that is standard practice all around.
Yes, I think there are two things that you pointed out. I mean, the first one is that there is never really a serious focus on teaching. And if you just look at the business model of higher education, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, the students pay the fees. The fees then go into some kind of corpus. So in many ways, most private universities are like hedge funds now that are essentially large asset management companies that also give classes. And I'm quoting Scott Galloway here, it's not my framing. And the professors are incentivized, or they get tenure based on their research chops. And so they have, and Alex Edmonds, who was an inaugural guest on my other podcast, Part Maven, Part Maverick, he even spoke about this, where when he was tenure track at Wharton, they told him, yeah, it's, you have to teach a bunch of stuff, but like, don't overdo it or don't be too good at it, because it might even reflect badly for your tenure decision. And that's completely absurd, because essentially you have the students paying for this education. The university itself is like a hedge fund offering classes. The faculty are incentivized not necessarily to teach the people who've paid for it, but they're incentivized to publish and quote unquote do research to build the brand of the university. And so I think just this structural setup tells you why so much is broken and why there is so much anger about college and online and education online, because this clearly doesn't look like the person paying is the institution is not designed to give value to the person paying.
Totally. Yeah.
Right. And I think this is a structural breakdown of why it's broken. And everyone knows it. And every university is like that. I mean, it's not, there's no need to finger point here. I think every university is set up like this. And, the faculty are essentially in a brand war to get publication awards, etc., to increase fees. The fees get increased, the students pay them to get in. And then, at the end, it's an asset management company with tax benefits.
And even the non-fee paying public universities like the majority is still
in Europe.
Germany, or just if you stay with our country, you have the same mechanisms because that's just how academia is structured, and the teaching is just not front and center. Yeah, clearly.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And the second point, I think, which was around learning what it means to learn. I think if I were to look back at my schooling, I think that's the one and only thing that I learned in school, and I taught it to myself, more or less. I had, sort of mentors or people who inspired me or I learned from, and that's a very important part of the learning process. But essentially, the ability to learn, I think, is the only thing that really matters. Like, that's, if you build that muscle, I think the rest is not really relevant, because by definition, you can then just learn it at any point. So this is something that I think I try to put front and center when I'm teaching. I make it very clear that there is a syllabus, there's a bunch of stuff we'll look at, but the core is obviously to learn, because once you unlock that, it's like God mode in a computer game or whatever, right? It's like a cheat code, which then allows you to win the game. So then it does not, then playing a certain level in a certain way does not matter as much. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that? And what do you think an institution that's trying to achieve this, what are the things it should keep in mind, and what are sort of what are additional things it can unlock?
Yeah, I mean, I think skill to learn has probably two fundamental dimensions. One is more of an attitude, which is, learning is something that is coming out of yourself. It's not something that somebody else imposes.
It's intrinsic.
It's intrinsic, and it's intrinsic. It has to be intrinsic so that it is true learning. Because if it's imposed by somebody else, you're in this forced structure. You have an external reward system. For instance, somebody else tells you this is the bar that you have to jump. You jump it, and then I tell you you've done a good job. Whereas maybe you don't want to jump a bar. Maybe you want to jump through a hoop, or you want to jump in the water, whatever you want to do. And the reward system is that something that you truly wanted and you achieved. And you get this reward from knowing that you've done it by yourself. So it's this external versus internal or intrinsic as a fundamental thing. And also another fundamental thing is that you're very active. It's not a passive thing. It's not a passive entertainment. It's not just, I have to do it because the structure requires it. So one thing is that learning is something that you do because you want it, because this is where you want to go, very fundamentally. And then the second element is that there are just a lot of really techniques that you can master. Because if you look at this whole learning process or panorama, it all has to start off with a certain degree of knowing who you are, what your needs are. Questions like, what options do you want to have in life? Like the students at Mood, for instance, a lot of them come from abroad. Do you want to stay in Germany, or do you want to go back to your country? I mean, what are the options? How do you what is the picture you form of yourself in the future? And once you have this clear or clearer, because it's a process, it's an evolving process, then you can start thinking about, okay, if this is what I want, what is required? What do I currently have? What is the difference between this, what I need, and what I currently have? So this is just setting the scene, and then the whole strategic component starts, and you have to make your next move. If this is what I want, how do I get there? And there's this whole self-analysis and self-reflection required. And then there are a bunch of other questions. For instance, who are your masters? Is this my professor, or maybe somebody who I just truly admire? How do I find them? How do I find my masters and mentors? And then once I found them, what am I going to do with them? You need a lot of, then again, techniques, learning techniques, such as you have to observe them. You have to ask good questions. Do you have questions? Are you able to put yourself into a situation and look at the situation not as, something uncomfortable, but maybe like an experiment, something you can, again, you have to keep it in your own hand and use it as a tool to achieve something. So, I mean, there's just a whole, and that's what we're trying to do with the students, right? A whole spectrum of methods and techniques that you can master or not master. And once you have them, it's exactly like you say, you can open any door with these tools. It's a universal key.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think to sort of understand how you came to this sort of point or this conclusion, I want to go back a bit in time to when you were, I think it was somewhere in Boston. I don't know whether you were at Harvard or at MIT then. You kind of decided to grab a bike and bike across the United States, right? And I think that was the start of learning from an adventure for you. So do you want to speak about how you came up with this idea of learning from an adventure? What are all the adventures you've done? And you've done a really impressive bunch of things. So it'd be nice if you could go, one by one through them, chronologically or otherwise, and really unpack what were you like at the outset? What was the journey like on the adventure when you came out of it on the other side? How did it change you as a person in surprising ways?
Yeah. Yes, that's exactly right. I think my first memory of an adventure was actually way, way earlier. I thought of this the other day. It's actually quite interesting. Where does that come from? One of your students asked me the question, what was your first adventure? And it was really when I was a small kid and I had a pony. And as I said, I grew up in a very free way. There was not really many, if at all, any prohibitions. I was allowed to do pretty much everything because I was reasonable enough. I didn't do stupid things, except there was one thing. I was not really supposed to go out with this pony and go for a ride in nature by myself. Usually there was always somebody who accompanied me, so it was no big deal. But then at some point, it really it hit me. And I thought, okay, my dad is at the hospital. My mom was doing something else. I was all by myself. So, okay, now what happens if I do this? That was the thing, what happens if I do that? So
and how old were you then? Just to
8, 9, young.
Okay.
And I just grabbed the saddle and the bridle and the pony. And somehow the pony must have felt that there's something serious going on because it was really very well behaved, which was not always the case. And then we just went out and went for a walk and a trot and a gallop and came back. And I was hugely proud of myself. I told it to my parents. They were not wildly keen in the beginning, but then they were also proud of myself because I managed. And I think this is what this taught me, that it's worthwhile to try it out. When this question comes up in your head, what happens if? What happens if I do something I've never done before? Not only is it a real, it's a real excitement, but then if you do it, more often than not, it's really worthwhile and you figure out something for yourself. And this, what you figure out for yourself, is this true learning. So
it's about pushing the boundaries, right? In many ways, it's just saying, hey, let me push and see how far I can take this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so it was just very rewarding. And then you refer to my trip across the United States. That was much later. That was when I had my year at Harvard. Harvard and MIT was pretty much in parallel. I mean, they're all pretty much in the same spot. And one evening, I can't even remember this evening, I had this map, a National Geographic map of the United States on my wall. Pretty much in the first week, I bought this map and I looked at it constantly. And then I thought, I'm on the East Coast. What happens if, always this question, I just hop on my bike. Of course, I have a bike. I'm biking all the time. And I just keep going until I come out on the other end. And thought, I will only know if I do it. And then
to be sure, you were not drunk or high at that point when you asked yourself that question.
Well, that was the spark. But then the next day, I got so excited about it that I just started to put it into action. So I went to the bike shop. I bought my touring bike. And then I had a bunch of other things that I needed, a sleeping bag, so fundamentals, a tent. But then I hopped on, and one day I started at home, went down the stairs, sat on my bike, closed the door, and then I left. And
had you ever done something like this before in Germany and Europe, or was it really the first time ever then?
Not at all. I mean, I was not like bike touring every weekend or had a week here and then. No, zero. For me, biking is a means of transportation. Right. I go to see my friends. I go to whatever, work, or it's just a means of transportation, my only one. So it's just a normal thing to...
like most people, right?
Yeah. But I just thought that's a cool idea. And it was the most rewarding thing at all. I mean, and I have this tendency to look at everything from a learning perspective. And if I look at...
Is this looking back and connecting the dots, or do you actually feel it while you're doing it?
It's both, because, there are a lot of adventurers or extreme sports people that I know and met. They just throw themselves into an adventure. They just sort of provoke the devil one more time and see whether they survive it. And they come out and say, we made it one more time, we survived. And nothing more happens in the head. It's all right. Everyone does things whichever way they want. But for me, it's always this very interesting question.
So those are the adrenaline junkies, right? They just want that adrenaline high, and that's what you're describing. Yeah.
Exactly. That does the trick for them. For me, it's more like when I'm in this situation, I just constantly observe what's going on. And it's so interesting, including, I mean, you observe what's going on around you, but you also observe yourself and to just see, you know, how do you react to these things that you've never encountered in your life? And then in hindsight, I think from this America trip, I think I can pinpoint for every major adventure that I've thrown myself into, there was at least one major thing that I learned. And for the America tour, there's one absolutely fundamental thing, which is I just learned how to talk to any person and not only just have a banal chit-chat conversation, but extremely profound conversations in no time, because you arrive somewhere, you meet somebody, a person you've never seen in your life, and you will leave tomorrow again. So there's no relationship. It's just the instant where this happens. And this for me is one of my most important professional skills, be it for a documentary film or when I write my book and I have to interview somebody, or it's just relating. I do trainings and I can relate to people very easily, etc. So this is an absolutely fundamental skill that I learned in the street, talking to any stranger crossing my way. And then I had a bunch of other adventures. I went I said, okay, now I've done this in the United States.
So it's interesting you say this, because I think this skill is something that's really underappreciated. I mean, I admire it tremendously. And I always say the people I look up to are those who can speak to the president and also speak to the hipster on the street on the same day and have a great time, right? Really blend in. And personally, I mean, the first time I think I got to sort of try this out was on the trading floor right out of university in my first job, because we were doing over-the-counter trades. And, you know, you're essentially speaking to a trader at another company you've probably never spoken before, and you might not speak again. I mean, you know, over time with some people, you could try to build a bit of a track record and relationship, but very often you didn't have any guarantee whether that would happen. And you have, you know, a few seconds, like a minute, a couple of minutes to close a deal worth, you know, hundreds of thousands or millions. And it's a bit that, you know, like, can you in that moment come across as competent, as trustworthy, and still make a buck? And some people really enjoy ripping other people off. I mean, why not? If you know, that's one way to do it. But if you really want to, I think, leverage these relationships over time, it makes a lot more sense to also leave something on the table for them, right? And I think you learn so much through that.
Absolutely. And then there were a number of other adventures. Like I was saying, what happens if I cross the United States? And I think, okay, what happens if I cross Russia? It's a completely different animal.
So why Russia? Was it like a Cold War thing saying that, oh, let's do this and that? Or like, I don't know, why Russia?
Not consciously, in the sense that I had somehow some relationship to this bipolar world Cold War thing. But
did you speak Russian already, or how come?
Yes, I did. I mean, I learned it. I didn't speak it as fluently as today, but I had enough to interact with people. And it was just this idea that, you know, here's one big country, one like big culture as well. And people treated me so well. And I felt all the time so, just welcome. And I thought, what happens if I do this in the other big player? And it was even greater, to be honest. I mean, the way Russians treat guests is in the usual Russian way excessive. It was fantastic. And I had some odd learnings there, which are a bit stereotypical, but still true, which is it happens that you meet alcoholics on the way. And they are very difficult to grasp, right? You don't know what to expect. It's not like the gut feeling that you have with normal people, not drunk, works differently. So I had to constantly de-escalate. And I had to judge situations which are much more critical, and also sometimes get out of situations unharmed. Mm-hmm. So that was another funny learning over and above. You learn the language, you learn all sorts of things. And then I had also one really, for me, very, very fundamental experience, which I developed this obsession with the Arctic and the ice. And I went there.
How did you develop it? While biking through Russia? Or like, how do you develop?
No, there was a very specific instance how these things sometimes are. I mean, I don't know what happens in the brain exactly, but it's really like falling in love with something. And I can there again, very often there's one moment. So I remember this. I was in Svalbard, which is above the Arctic Circle. It's between the North Pole and mainland Norway, but in the summer. So in June, when it's 24-hour sunlight and you have this very, very special atmosphere. So it's not Arctic winter. And there was a hut, and in the hut, there was a book. And I opened the book, and there was a picture of a man in a snowstorm. with the the color up, and it was black and white, and somehow this picture completely hit me. Some very strange romantic nerve, and I thought I will not rest until I experience the Arctic in this way. And then you develop your obsession and you do everything. And I worked literally for almost 2 years to make it happen. And then it's just, again, this question, what happens if I sleep and live outside 24/7 when it's minus 40? You asked me about, have you done a bike trip before? I hadn't even camped out in less than 10, 15 degrees. I mean, I was always camping when I was on my bike trips, but it was summer. So you can't imagine it. I mean, how can you even exist, let alone sleep in this environment? So that became a total obsession. And the interesting insight from this trip or these trips is that you are so stripped of anything that can be called comfort.
Mm-hmm.
And being comfortable, that you are just down to the absolute essence. And there is this quote that I really like from one of the extreme sports buddies that I was training with at some point. And he was saying, in the Arctic, nobody can hide his character. And that's quite true, because there's no facade. There's no society. There's no nothing to hide behind. And that's also quite interesting. When you look into this open book, what do you actually read there? And I can't think of any situation where I had that in such a strong way.
This is fascinating because I think Amundsen also had a similar quote around, it's really in the snow that I think the dog comes out of man, or, you see the difference between the dog and the man. And I think it's very much this, like when you push to the limits where, where comfort is essentially converged to zero, what happens then? Then the true self sort of comes out in all its dark ways too, right?
Exactly.
And you can't experience it otherwise. I mean, I think you really have to go through that to experience it. There is no way you can simulate it sitting at home on the couch.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Then you've also done trail running in Africa, right? Like, how did that come about? So, because we spoke of the US, we spoke of Russia, we spoke of extreme snow. I guess Africa is pretty hot and arid, or like, what's that like? Was it like another box that you decided to take, or did you fall in love with something again, or what happened there?
Taking boxes is not my thing.
Right. That's why I'm asking, right? That's why I'm asking. Yeah.
Yeah, it's more like I somehow started this, and it's the same probably phenomenon, which is what I call, what happens if you start running and you run your 10Ks. Oh, that, it works. And then you run 10K back and forth, and then you're almost like a half marathon distance. And then you say, oh, this is funny, this funny marathon thing that everyone is so obsessed about. Why don't we try it out? And then I had a bunch of friends who were really into trail running, and they were very strong runners. And they, at some point, they told me, oh, we signed up for this race. It's a mountain race. I did a lot of mountain races, and it's 52 kilometers or something like that. And then they were saying, oh, but there are other distances as well in the same race. And so if you sign up, I sign up as well. And then I signed up, and the same thing. I have never run so far, and I've never run so far, especially in the mountains. So it's the thing, what happens if? And then you do it. And then you get so thrilled by just this adding the next thing to see what happens. Because what if you run 80K over 4,000 meters climbing and down, and you run for 12, 13, 14 hours? It's completely insane. What happens to your body? What happens to your mind when you actually do it? And that again, and I always, when I even saw some race, I don't know, in Iceland, multi-stage, several day race, I got so excited about it. It's like, I want to experience this. And this is just how I did it. And in Africa, I was in Kenya, which is where all the long distance runners come from, right? So you're in this atmosphere where all these insane people run all day, and they have their training in the morning, and then they are your pacer while they already have done 2 hours of training, and you can't keep pace because they're so insanely strong. So that was a whole experience. Like, if you want to run and be surrounded by runners, Eton in Kenya is the place to go. So that was quite an experience too.
Yeah, crazy. I mean, so if we take a step back and look at the pattern across all these adventures, right? You're constantly sort of going out of your comfort zone with a relatively clear sort of context, and you're experiencing a whole bunch of stuff that you couldn't have experienced without going out of your comfort zone. And from that, you're reflecting and learning about yourself and the world, right, broadly. So you kind of take these experiences and you articulate your approach, your framework, which is learning not from an adventure, but learning as an adventure. So what was that journey like? What were the key sort of steps in that evolution, and how did you arrive at this, and why do you think it's so important?
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, if you think of it very fundamentally, what is learning? Learning is, if you look at it from a neuroscience perspective, it's synapses forming in your brain, right? That is very simply put what learning is. And then if you look at this process of synapses forming in your brain, it's always you have to step into a new situation. You have to confront yourself with something new. There are emotions involved, hopefully positive emotions involved, because again, in the brain, they have the function of making the synapses more strongly formed. There is actually a neurophysical reality to that. And then also very importantly, so that the learning is positive and not some sort of traumatizing experience that you have if you venture out too far, is that you always have to go home to some sort of stable base. This can be either inside yourself, this can be somebody else who's supporting you, this can be a physical place. I mean, this going out and coming back gesture is fundamentally what learning is about. And that is also fundamentally what all these adventures were about.
Yeah, I just want to pause here because this is something I think that gets celebrated a lot currently in contemporary culture, which is this idea of, jumping out from the plane and sort of figuring out the parachute or building the parachute while you're falling. That's how a lot of, the whole tech entrepreneur story is sold. This is all about jump off the plane and then, you kind of build your parachute while you're falling. I mean, I'm a bit skeptical about parts of that, and I think it also creates sometimes some of the problems we see with a lot of the technology and the people driving the technology today, right? But you have what I found refreshing in your approach is you have this idea of having a secure home base, right? So you're not doing something like you're definitely going out of your comfort zone and pushing your limits and being brave about stuff, but you're not being stupidly reckless. And I think if one looks at it from an evolutionary perspective, I think our species wouldn't have survived had we always been reckless. I think just purely from an evolutionary optimization perspective, I think your approach makes a lot more sense than what is often sold as a, as the modus operandi of success. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, two things really. One is if you jump out of a plane without solid parachute. I mean, it's kind of an absurd picture, but you have to be very, very solid. You have to be very solid and you have to be able to confront a huge amount of insecurity and what other people would probably identify as stress, which is fine. Some people are up for that. And maybe we can talk about these people a little later. But for just a normal human being, there's another element which is also part of the learning process, which is you will know yourself better and better. And you will know this fine line, which if you're on the good side of the line, you stretch yourself, you confront yourself, and you will learn something new. Because if you don't go out, you don't learn something new. That is clear. But if you go beyond that, you just risk to destabilize yourself. And when you never go out, you have no idea where this line is. And that's also very problematic. The people who pamper themselves all the time, they are so afraid of taking risk. They are so protective of their children. Now, like the slightest risk and danger is something seen as negative. This is hugely problematic in current society because you completely prevent people from finding out where this line is. It can always happen to you that for some reason you're thrown into a disaster. Unfortunately, that can happen, and then you have to deal with it. But if you do it in a controlled way, you prevent people from learning and you prevent people from the self-knowledge if you don't ever send them at or above that line. And this is also very, very fundamentally what education should be about, to really push people out and young people, children, to go out, to fall, to hurt themselves, to really get hurt, but then come back. Because just sending them out in the bush is not conducive. You will break somebody and you will weaken somebody. But just keeping them and protecting them will make them equally weak. So if you want strong people, there is a process that has to be respected.
Yeah, and I think to push this idea a bit more to the limit, I wanted to understand. So you recently met a guy called Tom, and I think the whole sort of this whole framework was deepened around the idea of learning from extreme situations. So who is Tom, and how did you why are extreme situations so important, and why are they such a good environment for learning?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Tom is my partner in crime now in evolving this idea even further and
So I
pushing.
just want to make it clear, it's not like real crime. It's just a partner in crime phrase because Tom is actually a cop, right?
Exactly. He is an ex-cop, ex-special forces cop. The crime is just, being disruptive, I guess. That's what we're trying to do. No, but seriously, I mean, why are these extreme situations not only so interesting, but so relevant? Because you could say somebody who has served in the special forces, in the military and in the police, what on earth does that have to do with my life? I don't even want to go there, not even think about going there. The thing is, though, an extreme situation really puts you on the spot. It is a real test of you and your personality, but also how well a team is functioning, for instance. People who are in extreme situations, they just simply cannot afford any mistakes. It will always be, fatal.
In many ways, it's almost the -40 scenario, but in day-to-day real life, right? Like we all face it, right? You're kind of bringing that seriousness to what you do.
That is true. I mean, in -40, if you take off your gloves, you get frostbite immediately. And when you have frostbites, when you can't touch things anymore, there's a whole series, like a domino effect of things that can happen if you make a mistake in -40. That's quite true. And then the interesting part is to not just stop there in awe, right? To say, wow, they are so impressive. They master the most extreme situations, any crisis. They know how to solve it. They are completely fine with an extreme level of uncertainty, etc. But then it's only interesting when you start really analyzing it and you start breaking it down to the absolute detail and essence to understand what are they actually doing, beyond these slogans of, oh, they're so resilient, or it's just a fantastic team. And there's sometimes like tiny, tiny things that you can observe. And we're doing this partly by having long conversations about, for instance, confronting fear or dealing with uncertainty, or how do you take creative decisions in a very structured environment, things like that, like lots of topics that you can explore, but then also to see them in action. You can just, and it's these tiny, tiny things. And once you have understood them and you can grasp them, then you can ask yourself, what does that have to do with my own life? If I translate that into my reality, be it the private or the professional reality, how can I use this inspiration to go further? So it's a very peculiar form of learning, but something that's hugely exciting and relevant, really.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in that context, there are two things you sort of highlight that stood out to me. I mean, one is professional coolness. And I think this is for anyone who's I don't know, done martial arts or sports or arts and music. I mean, you just see it, right? Mastery has just something super cool about it. You don't see people who are who have mastered their craft don't look like they're struggling, don't look like they're in pain. They just look super cool about it. And I think that just experiencing that, seeing that, taking inspiration from that, just those three things in themselves are valuable. And of course, if you can build yourself towards that level of mastery, then that's extremely rewarding. And the other idea is this observing the fine details of mastery. So building taste, building the kind of expertise in the craft that's needed to understand that sense of judgment of what is good and why is it good, I think is so valuable. So do you want to expand on why these two things are important?
Absolutely. I mean, what I guess stands out, because you mentioned this term of professional coolness, I think it's probably a form of ultimate responsibility. And again, that I see so many things in these like special forces people like Tom and many others who work in this sphere as a real counterpoint to a lot of things that happen currently in society. And this total lack of responsibility taking, not owning your own decisions and all the consequences that follow, is something that I very much observe in society. And conversely, they are the last resort. Nobody else comes after them. They are only called if the standard, in this case, for instance, standard police, they don't know how to handle the situation. They call the special forces, and there's nobody who will follow them. They have to solve the problem. And that's a true freedom. Like, we mentioned this before. There's a freedom in this level of responsibility. So this is, again, at a very general level, what this stands for. And then Yes.
Yeah, I just want to draw a parallel briefly to the previous guest, Alexander Hoare, who is from Seahore and Co, the oldest privately held bank in the UK. So they're more than 350 years old, and they've successfully run this bank as a family for over 12 generations. They're in the 12th generation now. And one of the core things that was important to their success and this ability to just survive 350 years, just for context, that means they existed before the Bank of England was created. They existed even before the United States was created. And what Alexander said was the most important tenet for them is that all the partners of the bank have unlimited liability, meaning you take full accountability for your actions and the outcomes. And that really stands out to the large clearing banks, right? And like if we take Deutsche Bank in Germany and the amount of fines they've paid, I mean, just add the numbers up and it's ridiculous. And then, you have JP Morgan and all the other guys caught up in the Epstein files. And you just see how people just don't take responsibility for their actions. It's the same for airlines increasingly. It's the same for everything. It's the same for, large tech companies, like all over the place. I think a big problem in our society, similar to what you described, is businesses, politicians, and a whole bunch of people just not owning up to their responsibilities. And I think the question then is, okay, how do we change that? What can we do about it? We're powerless, etc. I think it just starts very personally. Can you ensure that you take full responsibility for your actions? Right, just on your front. You cannot change the world, you cannot change the system directly, but if every person just takes more responsibility for what they do, I think that's one clear, easy step. And I think if more and more people do it, that already slowly starts solving the problem.
Couldn't agree more.
So I think that this was just an interesting parallel, because we are discussing learning and education and what it means, as part of the human experience, but there are just so many parallels with business, with investing, etc.
But this is what we were saying before, and our own experience in these alternative schools. It is a pathway towards responsibility taking, and it's very fundamentally linked to education. Because if you constantly tell someone what they should learn and what they should know and what they should do all day long, you crash any attempt to develop a sense of responsibility. This is the ultimate link. Conversely, if you constantly ask a young person, what do you want? What do you think? You have to know by yourself. Then I will support you, but you have to know. This is the pathway towards responsibility taking, because you choose and you have to stand up for it. You have the freedom to do it, but then you have to stand up for it. So it's like, this is the fundamental thing that education can either destroy or promote.
Yeah, and to be honest, I think I was so fortunate that, at the age of 15, I entered a sort of special part of the school, or like a subset of the already relatively progressive alternative school called Free Progress. And it was a section where you came on the first day of the academic year. They would give you a blank timetable and a pen, and you went around deciding what you wanted to study. So you picked what you want to study and with which teacher. And for the first, I think, a few days or the first few weeks, there was a big hall and all the teachers had their stand, a bit like at a trade fair or a buffet or whatever, right? Picture whatever you want. So you have these, and you go in there with that blank piece of paper. You are taking ownership for your entire academic year. And of course, you have a guide, right? So every person was assigned a guide, or in your language, a master in that sense, someone you could, whose mind you could pick, hopefully whom you admired, etc., and who would help shape your decisions. But at the end, it was you that picked what you wanted to do. And of course, then for everyone else at the undergraduate level, it was this exact same pattern, but now it was open for everyone. But to start at 15 with that level of responsibility was just phenomenal, because again, you're confronted with the big questions, because no one is telling you what to do. I mean, you need to figure out what you want to do. And a lot of people actually didn't do anything. So I remember there were a bunch of, not a bunch of people, but like there were 1 or 2 people out of, let's say, 10 or 12 or 15 or so. So about 10% just doesn't do anything. So they would come and lie down and sleep part of the school. And no one said anything. I think that was the point, which is, hey, it's okay, do that. Like, come to school and sleep if you want for like a week or a month. At some point, it should dawn on you or not that this is not working, right? Like, this is not something this is not a long-term, sensible strategy. And I think that's also part of the thing, right? I mean, you'd rather learn it at 15, having done that, than at 40.
Absolutely. At all.
Or later.
Yeah, totally. So did they wake up at some point, these students?
Yeah, to some extent, and I think the fascinating thing is the people who come, like the diversity of things that people who do after coming out of the school is just phenomenal. I mean, just in my class, I've had, a bunch of people go into obviously sort of more formal academia and get, go to reputed places, get degrees, etc. But that's not all, right? I think I've had, I have classmates who've gone really to the top of sports. One of my classmates became, I think, the deputy coach, or as part of the core coaching team of one of the largest clubs for cricket, which is very big in India. A lot of money. It's like a bit like football in Europe, right? So a bit like a Premier League team, and to be part of the coaching team without having gone to like a formalized sports school or something, right? Without having gone to a specialized sports school in itself is just phenomenal. Another classmate, who enjoyed photography, and he's making a bunch of films and shoots and doing some really great work. And these are just two examples. I mean, I could just go on, and I think that is what is fascinating, is just see a bunch of people who studied together in one system that just taught them to take responsibility, just branch out into an amazingly diverse and fascinating bunch of things. And I don't think a specialized education wouldn't have done that, right? If we all went to a music conservatory, or we went to a specialized sports academy or something, we wouldn't have all turned out like that. And I think that is what is fascinating, is you give that freedom, and with that comes the responsibility. So I'm trying not to quote Spider-Man here, but I think that's broadly the idea.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And this kind of, I mean, so the other side of the coin, right, is fear driven, right? You brought this up a bunch of times, including more recently, where you have the default state being people driven by fear, right? Society driven by fear. And very often what looks like the mainstream, what looks like consent, what looks like people agreeing to something, is essentially just a manifestation of fear. So I always joke, like, a lot of these sort of, consulting, quote unquote, best practices that are sold, in slide deck after slide deck to company after company, is essentially just groupthink. And if you think about where that groupthink comes from, it's essentially fear driven. Is, I want to cover my ass. I don't want to take responsibility for what will happen. So I'd rather bring in some big name consulting company, put their logo on it, and if it goes wrong, I can blame them, right? So I keep my job. And I think it's I mean, so much of business and companies are getting shitified precisely because of people not willing to own up and take responsibility. And so, do you want to expand on where does this fear start? If we go back really to childhood, to schooling, where does this fear start? Why is this fear such a big part of our society?
I mean, one thing is to go down the individual chronological.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's take someone's life, right, from birth to death, right? If we just take a human life, a generic human life from birth to death, where does fear emerge, and why and how, right? And what's going on? Like, if we just sort of, sort of zoom in and expand on all the key phases where fear plays such a role.
Yeah. I could say, in short, it's a lack of adventure, because only if you go out and experience an adventure, and you do it in the way that I've described before, that you're not just sent to the bush. And when you're young, you don't have the means to survive in the bush. You have to have some sort of backing somewhere. So if it's done in a reasonable and sensible way, which is you're sent out, but you can always come back. And there's always somebody who celebrates that you dared to go out, and they welcome you back and say, wow, you dared to do that, and see how rewarding it is to go out. That's the only way how you build a shield against fear. Because again, if you just send somebody out and they have a really bad experience and they can't find their way back home, that's bad. That will break them. Equally, if you go home and people at home tell you, sure, that's normal. You're 8 years old. You go up by yourself, I don't know, go to the shop and buy whatever it is, like what your mini adventures, the mini adventures, right? All day long you can have adventures. And they come home and say, wow, cool, you made it. That's really cool. If somebody just said, yeah, that's normal, it's like what we expect from you, that's also not building strength in anyone. And then conversely, if you always stay at home, you just get afraid of going out because you've never been there. And it builds up like something that is probably too big and scary to even venture out there. So that's the other alternative. And Our society in Europe, if you think of it, or let's pick Germany again, since 70 years at least, there was not much out there as a true adventure. If you ask me at the individual level, that's this gesture of being sent into the adventure, but to be able to come back. If you look at the society or the societal level, there was just not much of an adventure. You were not tested. You were not provoked. Everything was pampering you, and it was maybe too comfortable and easy. I mean, no, I'm not saying there are lots of people who have their individual tragedies, things happen, I mean, you understand what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, I mean, the setup, the paradigm within which you operate is one of comfort, of, big daddy taking care of you in the form of the state. It's about it's about staying in your swim lane and all of that. And I think that's why we're so much, we're in such a deep crisis in Germany, because we just got, like, it's this, we've optimized within this paradigm, and this paradigm is just not reality. And like, it's just, this paradigm is so far away from, I mean, it was never reality, but at least it was close to reality. Now reality has moved so far away from this, and we're still in denial. And I think that is what is worrying. We're just constantly in denial because we're driven by fear. We just want to close our eyes. We want to put our head in the sand, supposedly like ostriches do, and just hope reality comes back to this. And it's just not how reality operates. And I think that is what is worrying.
That is absolutely true. And the absurd thing is, it seems like the fewer events there are that would trigger fear, like actual fear, the more this imagined fear rises. And if that's the fundamental approach to life, then you have all these secondary effects, which is people conform. Nobody wants to stand out. Nobody wants to take responsibility. People are, everyone who stands out and maybe criticize or put the finger in the wound, they're silenced because they're uncomfortable. So you are there in your comfortable state of mind, somebody who steers the pot. Nobody wants that. I mean, that's uncomfortable. But that's exactly what you say, is a denial of the reality. And for too long, there was too much comfort. So I believe that's where there's this presence of fear comes from that, both at the individual level and at the societal level.
Yeah, and I think the most important thing is that it's the gap between reality and these assumptions has widened to such a degree that you can't ignore it anymore. And I think the way you described it also, it's almost like fear has its own immune system, right? And so it really attacks people who try to do something about it. And I think that is what is more worrying, because that sort of bad kind of immune system, right? It's almost like it's almost like a form of cancer that just kills anything that tries to do something good and positive. And I think that really needs to be fixed. But to be honest, I mean, I think you see this pattern around the world, right? You could look at Putin's Russia now with the absurdity of the war year after year, just making the country worse. You could look at it, you could see this in the United States in so many ways. Things are broken. You see it in China, you see it in India. I'm just picking all the large regions, but it's a similar pattern, right? The problems are different, and the paradigms within which they operate are different. But I think things are breaking, and very often, unfortunately, the go-to response is fear as a driver of decision making, fear as a driver of goals, fear as a driver of execution. And in many ways, I think what you argue is that the others, like, we started from learning as an adventure, we looked at fear as the complement or as the other side of the coin. But now if we don't want to be fear driven, what are we driven by? And I think that's curiosity, right? Because when you say adventure, what you kind of mean is at the end curiosity, right? So do not be driven by fear, be driven by curiosity instead. And in any situation, if you feel you have fear, and for anyone listening, I think if you just sort of self-aware and you realize I'm driven by fear in this moment, flip it on its head and say, what would I do if I were curious in this exact situation, and then act accordingly. And I think that gives you the answer, and the answer is within you. I think that's the nice thing, is it's not about learn this 3-step framework, or memorize these 5 things. It's much more in this setting, in that situation, in that moment, in that place. Ask yourself, am I acting out of fear? If I am, how would I act out of curiosity?
Exactly. And am I reacting to something, or am I in control of the situation? Can I flip the situation on its head and say, oh, this is an experiment? It's not a scary situation that I'm thrown into, but no, stop. How can I how can I reframe this and see it with all the curiosity that you need as something where, again, where probably we learn something and just, that I can handle. And maybe relating this back to this learning from extreme situations and learning from people who master extreme situations. There's also a really, really interesting parallel notion here, which is instead of constantly looking at yourself and all your sensitivities and whether you feel well or not so well in the situation, you can again flip this one and say, okay, what does the situation require? It's not so much about me now in the situation. It's like, what do I have to do to handle it? And that also frees you up, right? If you spend all day long to see whether you're just in the right state to do this or that, you never get to do anything. And I think this is also something you can really, truly learn from people who are professionally handling extreme situations. They are not very concerned with their own sensitivities. And conversely, what they pay a lot of attention to is their mates right and left. Are they safe? Do they have everything they need? And, are we jointly handling this situation? And if that's the focus, and the focus is on the curiosity, if you're not on duty, then the world looks completely different. And there's quite a need of much more of that and less sensitivities, less, being complicated and being difficult, and less just being fear-driven and full of angst.
You've said something really deep and powerful here. I just want to expand on that. I mean, we have these very polarized extremes in society today. So you have like the woke and the anti-woke, right? And I think what you said, I just sort of extract two things that you said. So one was it's about obsessing and focusing on the curiosity and the reality of the situation. And the second thing is it's about your mates, right? Left and right, who are the people involved. And if we sort of extract two things from here, one is don't be narcissistic. It's not about you. It's about curiosity. It's about the situations. It's about the reality you're in. It's not about you. And the second thing is it's about empathy. It's again not about you. It's about the people around you. And I think what the sort of anti-woke movement does not understand is they just destroy empathy. They don't realize that empathy is such a big foundation of our humanity, of us as a species. And I think what the woke bunch don't understand is that it's essentially narcissism at its worst in some ways, right? Because all you're doing is just obsessing and playing the victim and being the victim and whatnot, right? And it's not about you. Like, look out of your shell and see the world for what it is and acknowledge it for what it is and do something about it. And I think if you take sort of these two things together, you essentially just destroy these two extremes, because I think the danger is to polarize on one of these two extremes. But these two extremes are these are mirages, these are fake things that have emerged because this, I would say, very central reality has not been articulated clearly, right? Because once you articulate it like that, it's about curiosity, it's about the world, it's about a sense of agency and responsibility in that world. And it's not a responsibility just for yourself. It's not about stuffing your pockets. It's also about others. You bring these two things together and both the woke and the anti-woke essentially, disappear, right? Those are fake formulations. Those are fake gods, fake ideals, fake articulations. And I think it's as simple as that. And I don't think we're we're oversimplifying anything here.
I absolutely agree. And it's exactly like you say, when there is no real issue to put your attention to, these extremes at the margin, they blossom and they are of no use. And conversely, if there's something real, and there are enough problems in the world that you can turn your attention to, if you turn your attention to some of these problems and your contribution to solving them, all these things at the margin, they just disappear. They are of no importance whatsoever. The only importance is, okay, what's at stake here and how can I solve this problem? And again, for too many decades, maybe there weren't enough problems. And now that problems emerge, we don't really know how to deal with them anymore. We're only too concerned with, how we wake up, what's our name today, whatever the issue is, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that is the general move.
I think the problems were always there. It's just that increasingly both the political class or the sort of in quotes ruling class, it need not just be political, it's business and everyone else, like let's say the leading class and everyone else, right? I think there is this idea of both have deluded themselves into saying, oh, there are no problems. And then, because if we acknowledge there are problems, then we have to speak about those problems and we have to do something about those problems. But it's so much easier to just distract yourself by creating these two extremes. And that is really bizarre. Like, I don't know, if you think about it from a purely evolutionary perspective, I can't imagine any species doing something like that, because I think that's the biggest danger to survival as a species, is when you start creating these weird notions that have no empirical reality really, and then you turn them into ideology, into ethics, into a whole bunch of stuff. And and both extremes are destructive, because one denies empathy and the other denies taking responsibility and curiosity. And the moment you bring them together, it's suddenly totally okay. Right? Suddenly, all these problems get fixed, because these two things should be together. They shouldn't be separated. One thing that emerges, though, from all this fear-based decision making in society is that you have increasing censorship, right? So if you say something that's not in the mainstream that people don't like, you start getting blocked. And I think a lot of people have brought this up over the years, that censorship, whether it's increasing or not, can be debated, but at least people perhaps are more empowered today to speak out. And so it feels like there's more censorship, at least. You have a personal example of sort of censorship that you faced. And you also have a personal story in your family about how your grandmother stood up to censorship. Do you want, if you're comfortable, do you want to share both of these situations, just to make this very personal and very, and very, very concrete for anyone listening?
Sure. I mean, we are living in a free society in principle, right? So in theory, these things shouldn't play a huge role. So as you said, I just had a recent reminder that this is not quite the case. And without going into the details, but I had to deal with a government institution. I was supposed to give a contribution, written and orally, and I had prepared something, and
was that some kind of policy position or something, right? When you say contribution, it's not financial. It's just
No,
you
sorry.
giving your
It's an
ideas.
intellectual contribution. Yeah. So I had
Yeah.
to give an intellectual contribution from my perspective with my expertise on education and learning. And like we are doing this since an hour and a half now, we point to things that are very good and desirable and exciting, but we also point to things that are not going well. So we try also really to find out and to understand how things are set up and what's in our way and what can be solved, etc. So it's also an intellectual confrontation with just trying to understand what's going on. So I was just as a starting point, I was putting my finger into something which I thought was worth criticizing as a starting point to then develop an alternative, because I mean, obviously, just pointing to everything that's bad is not helpful either. And I was very explicitly and literally asked to take that out. And I was shocked. I mean, the suggestion was to come up with something more constructive, which in the end is the same thing, right? I mean, the essence is that you're asked to take out something that is an explicit criticism of something an official institution is doing. And I mean, I was shocked, and that in combination with being forced to use a certain set of words and avoid a set of other words. I mean, honestly, that reminds me very much of things happening soon 100 years ago in our country. And it's just scary. I mean, I had obviously running and cold down my back when I was exposed in this situation. I thought, my goodness, right? If my grandmother, and you are referring to that, she was, because all men were at war, she was leading a hospital. And there was this anecdote, a bunch of anecdotes in my family. I'm always these hero stories that keep being told from one generation to the
Because
other.
they inspire you. I think this is such an important part of growing up and identity, because I think you hear these stories, they shape you, and they're ideals for you, right? You try to live up to them.
Sure. And I mean, one of the stories was that she was the director of this hospital, and there was some, I don't know, reunion where somebody was saying such and such passed away. And then my grandma was going, oh, that's a pity, because that was the biggest Nazi and that was the biggest swine in how he behaved. And she was just, from her heart was saying, oh, that's a pity. And then somebody was saying, oh, how do you mean? And then she was just saying, I mean, isn't that a shame that somebody passed away? And then they muted her. They muted her to some village, because, I mean, Munich, as the biggest hospital, was not quite the place where you wanted a person who is
Was critical.
old enough to utter something like that. And that's even a story from the previous generation. civil disobedience where they put in the entrance of the place. They were still in the village in Bavaria. They put a hat, they put a stick in the ground and a hat. I mean, just imagine how insane and ridiculous this is. But I can imagine it's happening here around the corner, to be quite honest. Times have not changed. People have not changed. And the ask was, as it was the general ask during these years, to salute this hat on the
Why?
stick, saying Heil Hitler, because that's just, you enter the place and you salute. And I mean, it's just completely absurd. It's completely ridiculous and absurd. It's just about obedience. And that was my grandmother.
And fear and forcing people to conform,
Exactly.
right? It's about fear and conformism.
Is to demonstrate publicly that you conform, you salute this thing. And my grandmother, great grandmother, that was my grandmother's mother, she was just standing and laughing next to everyone who did that. But I mean, nothing happened to them. Luckily, it was always in the last minute sort of handled somehow. Nobody was really, I mean, you die because you do things like that back then. But there are these stories, and I always think, I mean, my goodness, if my grandmother speaks up that way, knowing what environment she's in, if we in our generation, in our pseudo-democratic, democracy today, we are not even daring to point to things just because we fear personal disadvantages, which is what happens. I lost that gig. I lost my fee that was attached to it just because I insisted that I speak up, I don't shut up. And this is such a tiny, ridiculous instance if you compare it to historical times. But seriously, I mean, if we are already at that level, we are quite advanced. So I find that very scary. And for me, it was a reminder to have my eyes open and to speak up, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, I have a funny personal anecdote too from my grandfather's best friend who, my grandparents died before I was born, so I never got to hang out with them. But this, my grandfather's best friend was kind of like my proxy grandfather. And I think he was a young man in colonial times, and he would just go climb up the telegraph poles and clip the wires. So he couldn't do much, as a, towards independence, but that was the one thing he could do. And so he would just do that. And then, they would arrest him, put him in jail. And he would, when he would come out, he would again go and clip the pole. At some point they said, okay, we won't lock you up, you just promise you're not going to do this again. And so I think it's just like, just like laughing at people saluting a stick and a hat, I think there are small actions and there are small ways you can as an individual, it's not, it's obviously you have to go out of your comfort zone and it's not fun, but I think there are small ways to express this, and I think it needs to be expressed. I think every person should express what they, how they see things, and should try to prevent this kind of conformism from taking place, and this narrative building and spinning about, and especially about some kind of supreme leader, or the state being sovereign above everything else, and that society and people don't matter. And I think these things are just very worrisome. But as you said also, I think there is always a personal cost involved, but I think that is what it means to have values, is do you bleed for them? And I think there's another guest, Luca Delana, was on the show, and he shares a story from early in his career when they were supposed to go on a field trip, and I think he was specialized in industrial safety. And the director, or some big shot in the firm, was taking them along, and they go to the bus, and the bus didn't have seat belts. And the guy refused to get in the bus. He said, "We were all going to wait. We will wait for a bus to come that follows the norms, because if we're going to inspect a factory for safety and security norms, it does not make any sense if we go in a bus that does not follow the norms." And of course it was a huge waste. Like if you just calculate the hourly rates of all those people waiting, like 100 people waiting, that's a huge amount of money. But that was the way to send a signal to every junior person on the team. If we stand for something, we're ready to bleed for it, because if you don't bleed for it and bleed for it publicly, you don't really care about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we are discussing now sounds like very minor issues, and you can say, "Oh, that's ridiculous." The thing is, it always starts with minor issues, and
it adds up.
Exactly. And it builds up and it becomes normalized. If it's normalized that you have to take out half a sentence from your text, what's the next step, right? And for me, this is very fundamental. I fundamentally refuse, because if you don't fundamentally refuse and you already disrespect your own values, you will do it at every stage of the way.
Yeah, and then, the first time it looks like it's not that bad. The second time you go one step further. By the third time, you're ready to kill 200 people, right? I mean, that's just how it starts, right? You kill you first, you just shoot someone, then you said, it's totally okay. Why don't you shoot the next person? And that's how violence and stupidity and a whole bunch of stuff spreads, right? And I mean, for me personally, it was really this whole, seeing the farce that that the role of technology has become in business first, with this whole digital transformation bullshit, and then, now with AI adoption. No one's asking the question, what value is it really creating? And no one's seriously bothered thinking this through. And if someone reaches out and says, hey, can you help us do this, right? I don't know, sort of use this technology or build this or build that. Building the thing for me is not the problem. The problem is if I'm not convinced it's going to create value, I don't want to do it. And it means, short term, you say no and you have a hit to your revenue. But I think that's the point. If you don't bleed for what you stand, I cannot write books that argue why a lot of stuff that's groupthink, that's packaged as best practices is done and that it creates a lot of harm. I cannot argue that on one hand and then go and do the same thing just to make revenue short term on the other hand. Those two things are not compatible. And I think these are all small acts of standing up for what you believe is true, is correct, and bleeding for it. But to sort of bring this back to education in some ways, right? I'm not unlike, a lot of people who are teachers or academics who've gone through the formal system and then kind of directly transitioned into teaching and academic roles. I spent 10 years in industry and I'm still sort of with one foot in industry. But I did do a very deep sort of workshop short course on pedagogy and how, you should teach stuff. And I think the concepts themselves were reasonable, were logically coherent, but overall, like the whole paradigm within which they were articulated just seemed completely unrealistic. And bear with me and correct me if I'm wrong, right? Because you know more about this stuff than me. But like the way pedagogy was taught, right? Whether it's ideas of the whole taxonomy around what are the different types of learning, whether it's this idea of constructive alignment, right, of sort of pointing stuff and defining, having a well-defined objective, stating the outcome, working around that, etc. All that makes a lot of sense. But in reality, most of the time, you don't really know what needs to be done. And I think that's, again, also a big problem with a lot of this whole agile and agility sort of obsession in business, which is like being agile is not necessarily a bad thing, but just being agile per se will not take you to the right place. And you don't always know what the right place is, right? So I almost felt like it was, this whole, like I just labeled it dog school pedagogy, because very much like the way I see people training dogs, which is, okay, you go from here to there, or you do this, or you sit down and you lift your paw or whatever, and I'll throw you a goodie, right? That's exactly and this deeply horrified me, which is I do not want to teach like that, because it's just inhuman. I don't like, these are students, these are humans, these are people I deeply care about, and I don't want to train them like dogs. I'm not going to teach math or programming with that kind of mechanism, because it's just absurd. That's not how the world operates. That's not how they will be successful, build stuff, and do something with their life. I mean, what is this dog school pedagogy and this obsession around a well-defined objective being known in advance? Sort of, I don't know, firstly, have I misunderstood what this is about? How do you see it? And why do you think this is so prevalent?
I mean, the thing with the dogs is mostly you keep them on the leash, right? So that's all right. You can treat dogs that way. But when it's about human beings, the whole point is to be off the leash, right? And we spent now an hour talking about responsibility taking and being curious and going out and confronting yourself with ill-defined situations and things like that. So none of what we have been discussing is something that you learn if dog pedagogy is applied. So, and this is, I think, where we started off with the whole discussion when you're asking me what's going wrong in education right now. And I was saying there's this disconnect between what the reality requires, which is inherently unpredictable, which is inherently messy, and which is inherently all over the place. And you have to find, if you don't have the strength inside yourself to A, know which of the 100 options you're taking, and B, that it's only you who can go there. I mean, that there's nobody who leads you along the way. So you don't make, with this, what you describe as the dog pedagogy, you don't make people stronger. You don't make people stronger when you define everything and you pretend that's how the world is working. And that leads back to something we also touched on, which is, if you are in the pseudo comfort all the time, not least because you put your head in the sand. I mean, you don't look into everything that's uncomfortable. Yeah, it looks pretty. It feels and looks pretty comfortable, and then you can stay on your leash. That's all right.
And it's very narcissistic. It's very selfish and narcissistic to do that.
It stops here the world, right, on the tip of your nose. But if you go beyond that and you look a little bit of what's going on outside, that's not going to help you. And it is, again, self-referential. If you use dog pedagogy to prepare people for life, then they will have a dog life, right? But that's not something that will really make us progress as a society. And I can't imagine this being particularly satisfying on the individual level either. So, I mean, I guess all we have been advocating for the last hour or two is to put things on its head. And again, to say we need more adventure throughout so that when it really hits you, and it feels like, whoa, now the wind is blowing, then you say, I know what I'm doing. And that can only be helpful.
Yeah, and I think that, and then, with that comes a new fear is if you're essentially training yourself as a dog during your learning process, right? Then during your education, then basically once you are a dog on a leash, then the next step of getting a robot dog or getting AI or whatever to do your job is not that far. And so I think that is the big problem, is not technology is going to take over all jobs. Is like, why are you doing that kind of stuff? And why are you not willing to do something else? And I think that is a much bigger problem. But we just criticize something. We said why something is broken or is not really right and is not functioning. But then the question is, okay, tell me how to do it differently. And I think one thing that stands out from your approach and your work is this idea of learning from a master, right? So you are learning from another human being. It's not, oh, here's a topic, here's a subject, here's a syllabus, and we will apply some kind of, constructive alignment to set a goal and then to go towards that goal and then examine whether you have achieved that goal and, go in this sort of repeated triangle. Instead of that, it's a lot more about building judgment, about observation, about curiosity, about exploring and experimentation by looking at another human, right? And of course, there's a lot of judgment involved in picking the master in the first place, right? So for you, I think it started with your dressage master. Do you want to share that whole journey, this whole concept, how it emerged? Because I think you see this in a bunch of cultures. You especially see this in Asian cultures. You have this in Japan in terms of the sensei. You have this China. You have this in India with the idea of the guru. So I mean, a bunch of cultures have this, and I'm not well versed in all the cultures of the world, but you have this obviously in the Greek tradition in Europe, etc. So you have this notion of a master. So what's this, and why is this probably an alternative way to think about learning and growing?
Yeah. It's another interesting one because it's also, in a way, and you're quoting all these ancient cultures, it is like an old concept that is almost discredited today. Because all is now of, you are the little king and the little king can be on top of everything. The thing is, when you have a master, very, very modest and humble. And
you have to surrender in some ways even, right?
Absolutely.
You surrender some parts of yourself, right? Your ego and...
Absolutely. Number one, you have to, there's clearly somebody who has the wisdom and the mastery that is way above you. So you better shut up and you observe and you listen. There's another thing is you have to deserve to become the student. And that is not a given.
Not everyone is taken, right? It's not just walk in, pay your fee, right? It's not about paying a fee.
I was about to say that. You cannot possibly buy your master. You have to deserve to be admitted to the circle. So that is and it's not about humbling somebody, like putting somebody down. It's just wait and see and step back and see what you can learn, because you are far away from it. But then it's also not at all a passive thing, right? In the first place, you have to form an ideal in your mind of what you're looking for into a master. The master admits you, but you choose them. You search for the master. You choose the master. At least that was my case. I mean, in classical dressage, I had a very clear ideal in mind about this form of art, about harmony and perfection, and this absolute sublime way of working with the horse, very concretely, but it's a very sort of special way of existence. So I searched for a long time to find this master, and then I had to prove myself, worthy of being around him, and then you essentially work hard every day. And this, if you do that, if you go through something like that as a young person, it really forms you, and you know what desire is about. You know what an obsession is, you know what it is to really strive for something, and it's almost like a question of life and death, whether you achieve it or not. And you just have somebody who is so way above you that you can look up to. So there's a beauty in that I think I absolutely don't want to miss. And then conversely, at some point, it is time to leave the master and to make sure you step onto your own pathway and you become somebody yourself. But to know this absolute ideal example, and to yeah, as you say, to surrender to that, and to you're in this person's hands, but it's not some algorithm. It's a real person with a character, with ideals, with a way of living their life. This is something tremendously valuable. And I think it sounds very old school, but to me, it was one of the most precious things I had in my life.
I mean, if you look at it purely, economically from a supply-demand perspective, right? As algorithms become more and more ubiquitous, the value they bring drops, right? And I think this is something that Ian Bremmer also argues, which is that, earlier we as a species were driven by nature and nurture, right? So the genes that were hard-coded sort of from a nature perspective, and the nurtures were very often how the environment within which those genes some genes developed and sort of, I forget the sort of biological terms, but like the way they would evolve in certain settings. And now it's increasingly nature, nurture, and algorithm. And I think as the algorithmic part becomes more and more ubiquitous, I think being able to intentionally pick a master and go in a certain direction becomes more and more valuable. And so there's even an economic argument to make why in these times, like in these technological times, this is something worth doing. And I think that does not mean that the master is perfect in any way. That does not mean that the master is forever. But I think it's about being intentional about picking the master at a certain stage in life and then growing and learning and going beyond. And I've been blessed to have my own set of, and it's always a whole portfolio. I don't think you never necessarily have to pick one person, right? It's always a bunch of people because you're learning a bunch of different things from them. And I think it's also at some point then becoming yourself worthy of being someone's master, right, on the path where you're paying forward, right? Because that's the other thing, I think what you learn from having a master is that you can't pay back, because we've created a society that's so transactional, and that at its best is always about paying back. You do something for me, I do something right back for you, which is better than if I just took from you and never gave anything, obviously. But there is a beauty in knowing that you cannot pay back your master. They're just at another level, right? You just can't pay them back. And what it teaches you then is to pay forward. And I think that requires such a crazy growth spurt in yourself, right? And I think it's so motivating to realize that you got something from someone, and you could see this as, hey, I took something and I got it for free. But if you just see it as, I got a debt from the future, right? So now, because I got this, it's not as if I sort of inherited it from my master. It's much more, it's a debt that I've got from a future generation or a future set of people, and it's my job to pay it back. And I owe this to the world, right? And I think that just gives you a much deeper sense of understanding of responsibility, again, back to the word responsibility of paying it forward.
Absolutely. And there is another interesting effect which goes both ways, both when you are the student and when you are at some point maybe yourself the master somebody's looking up to. It is an incredible motivation to be the best version of yourself. I mean, as I said, you want to show yourself worthy to be admitted, which means that you always have to be the best version of yourself. Conversely, or equally, when you are chosen by somebody as the master, you better be the best version of yourself because somebody's looking up to you. So it's quite a beautiful side effect, if you will. That's very motivating and very human in a way, in a very good way.
It is, and it's really magical. And I think There's an interesting sort of conversation emerging also across on the internet with a bunch of people writing or speaking about this. But we're probably in our little bubble, right, looking at a generation that is more obsessed with health and fitness and wellness than ever before, and yet we're extremely disconnected from each other, and the social tissue and relationships have really been destroyed. If you look at what it means to be in good health and well-being, it's not just about your VO2 max level, or I don't know, or the size of your bicep or whatever, right, or your grip strength. I mean, all those things are good, right? But it's not just that. It's so much more the idea of with whom are you learning, right? With whom are you getting better at the craft, and how do you approach the craft, right? You have that sense of surrender, of taking responsibility, of betterment, of passing on, that sense of gratitude. Are those emotions associated with what you do, or is it much more, is it more about, again, narcissism, about looking in the mirror and do I have the biggest bicep and where can I flex it and how can I seduce someone, or I don't know, whatever you plan to do with that. And I think those emotions are so much more part of well-being than just quantifiable, metrics of physical performance.
Yes, and I mean, if you want to stay with the dimension of the master or the whole potential in the end that learning processes can, which is the topic of our conversation, there's also always, I mean, if you work with a master, there's an ethical dimension and almost a spiritual dimension to it, right? You always choose this master, not only, I mean, it's not a master when it's just about very technical, it's about knowledge and skills. That's fine, but that's only the day-to-day basis. If you really work with a master,
It's the physical expression of the deeper truth, right, that you're trying to get to.
So, but if you work with the master who deserves the term, there's always a slightly more abstract dimension, which then becomes concrete in every single act, how they position themselves.
Because it is lived, right? It's not acted, it's actually lived.
Yeah, and I think this is also something, a dimension which is very, very interesting in the context of education. And I have a very interesting experience in that respect, because a couple of years back, I produced a documentary film. It's called Teachers for Life, and is all around the question, what is a teacher in the 21st century? What's that role? What's that task? And we worked with a bunch of fairly exceptional pedagogues and educators, including in the field of sports. And what was so surprising to me, the biggest learning in this whole thing, was we were trying very hard to show standard examples, because we didn't want to face the criticism. I mean, I come, like you, from a non-standard school, a free school, and then everyone is saying, yeah, I mean, this is just...
These guys are weird.
Yeah, and exactly. They're not part of the system. So everyone of us who are in the normal system, we cannot possibly do that. I mean, it's very nice and beautiful and inspirational, but it's not up to...
Not for us.
Exactly. So I was trying very hard for that reason to preempt that sort of criticism, to work with sort of as standard as possible. But even though we ended up working with, competitive sports and things that come across as standard, there was always a spiritual dimension to it. And it doesn't need to be, I don't know, some religious thing or something in a very formal sense, but it has this layer was always present. And it was something every single act and very concrete deed was referenced to. And I thought that was quite remarkable. And I hadn't thought about things that way. So again, if we want to put education and learning into context, it can mean very concrete things. We discussed a lot about the adventure and all these small things that you do along the way, but it's also very interesting to see that without that, it seems to be floating in the air as well. And that's something, again, interesting to consider when thinking about education. How is this level served? What does it mean for every single one? And you sort of can't get rid of it, whatever it means for every single person. But it's a layer of humanity or humanness, which, as much as the concrete is important, and we don't have enough of the concrete, maybe we also should include that level. And that's something also I find just worth thinking about. What does it mean for every single one of us? How do you relate to that?
And I'm really grateful to you for this insight, because at my school the core philosophy was integral education. So taking care of all aspects of being a human, right? And so there was the physical, sort of the emotional or vital, the mental and the spiritual, right? And so like all four aspects were considered and were given requisite levels of importance. And when you grow up in that, you don't know anything else, right? So like you see that like it's a lived reality that's all you know. So you can't even picture something that does not have all these four elements. And then as you grow up and then you come out of that system and then you see the rest of the world and you travel and you observe, and then you start asking yourself the question, is it possible to create an integral education without, like, could you carve out the spiritual bit and leave it out, right? Could you just cut it off in some form and say, we will have a really great integral education, but the spiritual component perhaps is kept out? And this is a question I always had in the back of my head. And then you visited my school at the start of this year, and I think when I asked you this question, you said, you, based on your extensive experience around the world, having seen like hundreds of schools and thousands of learning environments, you have never seen a situation that could, of true integral education that did not have a spiritual dimension. Do you want to expand on that, what it means, and also make it more concrete? Because I think what happens very often is people think of always a religious connotation, a bit like, let's say, the Catholic school your mom went to. And of course, you can have a religious, you can have a good integral education, perhaps with some kind of religious angle to it, right? We shouldn't rule it out, but at the same time, it need not be that. Like, I think the meaning of what you mean by spiritual can be a bunch of things, and perhaps you could also take a concrete example from your documentary film, and perhaps with Mbappe's trainer when he was a teenager. Like, what was that? Like, was there a spiritual aspect there, or I don't know? Like, if you can give a concrete example, I think that would help understand what you mean better.
I might actually also stay with your school and my observations there as a concrete example, because
Sure.
I think it's very difficult to talk about that, and I'm not trained to talk about it as a philosopher or as somebody who studied that at all. But I think it is expressed in a certain coherence, and if you have that spiritual layer, things can't fall apart, because it's always a reference point to see, is everything I'm doing in line with these values or in line with this general idea of, for instance, harmony. One of our examples in the film, they had the harmony of nature as their spiritual superstructure, which is totally fair, right? We are all part of nature. We are elements of nature, and there's a certain harmony in nature. And then every single act, the way you interact with other people, the way you treat yourself, the way you treat your environment, is it in line with that? And it also has the dimension, and that was something that was very present in your school, it has an aesthetic dimension. And it was something so striking for me, this very simple and very conscious aesthetic that was present in the school. And again, if you look at lots of schools, standard schools, they almost look like prisons or, like military compounds, and they are so ugly. And if that is possible, that such an environment is an environment where you're supposed to learn, what sort of spirit is in this institution, right? You can really ask yourself. Conversely, what I saw in your school, everything was so pleasant and so coherent and so full of beauty that you really feel and you see that this is the spirit of this institution. And it's just every single act can be referenced, I think. And if you don't have the spirit or the spiritual, then what are you referencing it? What are you referencing things with? So I think this is probably, if you want to say it in very, very simple terms, they're not very concrete. And as you already mentioned rightly, they can play out in all sorts of different ways. But if you don't have that, I think it's more easy that things fall apart, and that those things that we have described can take over. So it's a way of making things conscious. What are we doing here? What are our ideals, maybe our values, and what is the spirit that should be present when we're working and learning?
Yeah, and I think if I were to sort of frame this in business speak, it's this idea of a North Star, right? Like, what is this one thing that we like kind of, where we're headed? And you see that in like a bunch of like not not in most businesses. A lot of businesses just write a North Star like a slogan, but they don't live it. But the ones that actually live it and that pick the right ones, you really see the difference. It's interesting you spoke about the aesthetic element. Again, this is something, having grown up in that, never stood out to me. Like sometimes, when you are from within an environment, you don't see the walls around you, right? Or you don't see the structure around you. You have to sometimes get that external perspective, and that's something I really appreciate having got from you. And sort of to map it to the current sort of setting, I think what I found great at Munich University of Digital Technologies and Applied Sciences, right, where you also came to give a talk, and what we had there was an art exhibition for our engineering students, where again you think, why would you need an art exhibition for an engineering student? But it's like these small things, of these small acts of stitching together things to create just a fuller, better reality. I want to end on something that goes and that looks at life after formal education, right? So like once we look at the world of work, because you do work with companies on these themes, because I think no one will challenge the fact that education has become a lifelong thing now, and especially in the age of AI, or where algorithms are doing parts of cognitive work, it's become even more important to constantly learn and grow as humans. There is an idea of the second guest of my other podcast, Sangeet Paul Chowdhury, who speaks about the notion of operating above the algorithm. So, broadly, you have people who operate below the algorithm. So if you think of, food delivery, Uber drivers, like they're all being told to do stuff. Like the algorithm is essentially directing their actions. And then there are the people above the algorithm that are essentially building the algorithm. And broadly, I would say work, jobs, and opportunities have got split into these two. What I want for my students is always to keep in mind that you should strive to be above the algorithm, right? Not everyone perhaps can always do that. And in certain aspects, you will be under the algorithm, right? In certain aspects of your life. But broadly, you should have the sense of capability and agency to operate above the algorithm. And to do that, you need to be genuinely great at things. And human performance is a power law. We're not, unlike heights and weights, etc., we're not looking at distributions. There's very much a power law there. And if you are a top performer across a bunch of things, you will tend to be above the algorithm in more things. What do you think about human performance, and what do you think about managing, amazing performers?
I mean, I'm not sure how this now relates closely to learning, but I think if you manage the outstanding performers, we have touched on the horse and riding metaphor a couple of times.
Yeah. And let me connect it to learning, right? Let's say we do not do dog school pedagogy, and let's say we did not create an education system that sort of graduates a bunch of dogs on leashes, right? Let's say that's not our vision. Let's say that's not our model. Let's say that's not what we do. Let's say we actually create the kind of learning as an adventure mindset people who then come out, you can create that environment during their formal education. But let's say these people graduate, they go out in the world. Let's say for someone listening, they are managing a team of people. Let's say for someone who leads a company or an organization, you have an entire organization below you. And there's a whole bunch of, management dogma that tells you how to do this and how to do that. And it's just very similar to a lot of the mainstream pedagogy bullshit, right? Which is, you set the goal and then you do this constructive alignment, you set targets, you pay people bonuses based on doing A, B, C, D, etc. And like all of that is happening, and in some contexts and in some ways it has its merits, and to some extent it is all right. But you do not, that's not catering to the top 20%. It's not catering to the top 1%, but it's also not catering for the top 20% of human performance, right? Broadly speaking. So once we acknowledge that there's a bunch of people who have that, how do you let them flourish in a work setting, not just in a formal educational setting?
I mean, you referred to the dog pedagogy, preparing people to stay on the leash. I think outstanding characteristic of these people that we are referring to now as the top performers is that you have to let them off the leash. If you keep them on the leash or you put them, in some box, they will just die. That's not the environment they can function in. So if you want not only these performers to survive and flourish, but you want to get the most out of them, you have to let them run and put them with all their energy onto a useful path, so that they run into something, that is not just powering out their energy, but they're doing something really useful. But I think that is the essential thing. And then loops back to everything we've been talking about, responsibility. Let them take responsibility. They're able to. And conversely, don't handle them with fear. You might not be able to control at all, but that's the whole beauty. I mean, if you have these top performers, what you have to do is to hand the responsibility over. They can handle it, and you conversely have to get rid of your fears and the absolute need to control. This is the only way to get the most out of them and to evolve things forward. And if you talk about these things in a company context, there are lots of crises, lots of things emerging, and somebody has to take care of them. And I think it's the combination of having those people who are able to handle it, but also managing them in such a way that they can take full advantage of their strength, let them off the leash. I think this is something also that should be more widespread, and letting loose of this control frenzy that is all around.
That is fear driven again, right? Let it be curiosity driven and not fear driven.
Yeah.
Let it be about taking ownership and responsibility, and let it not be narcissistic and sort of, selfish, inward look, like not inward looking in a good way, but like selfish and sort of navel gazing. And let it be about empathy and empowering others, and not about, about sort of cutting and crushing and pushing things away. So this was a great conversation. Thank you so much, Kathrin. And on that note, hope to speak again in the future as your frameworks evolve and as you put it to, bring it to life. Thank you so much for coming on the System Gambit.
Thank you for hosting and for all the good questions.